Hey guys, this is your host Thomas Tyree here from On the Hot Podcast. Today, this will be the Combat Series episode number 119 for you guys today. And to kick off this week's episode of the Combat Series, I'll be sharing my own personal list of the biggest boxing fights that were never made in the modern era of boxing. So there was some pretty big boxing fights that could have been made, but were left off the table and don't realistically have a chance of happening or will never happen in the sport of boxing. So I'll be sharing my own personal list of those personal fights. Fight number one that comes to my mind will be Gervonta Davis versus Devin Haney. Now, Gervonta Davis versus Devin Haney at one particular point could have been one of the biggest fights to be made in the sport of boxing. I think if that fight were ever to be made, it would be a big deal, and that fight would obviously take place in a big city like Vegas in the United States. But I think this fight will never materialize, and it's unfortunate because Gervonta Davis and Devin Haney are some big household names in the sport of boxing, both in the prime of their careers currently in the sport of boxing. And their stories of how they came up, they were former allies together. They used to hang around each other as they grew in the sport of boxing, but then jealousy and leaked sparring footage that we see in Floyd Mayweather's gym between Tank and Haney. We know the sparring stories of how Devin Haney got the best out of shape Gervonta Davis. But in that sparring video that's leaked all across the internet now, Gervonta Davis realistically had Devin Haney out cold in the gym. And in a real fight, you would have stopped it if Devin Haney was truly knocked out in that ring like they claim. But based off of that, I think we should have got that fight at 135 when a few years ago, both were at that division fighting at a high level. Devin Haney was the undisputed champion at 135. Gervonta Davis was hanging around putting big fights up at 135. So I don't understand how they fumbled this big fight between Gervonta and Devin. Now with Devin Haney all the way up at 147 now at welterweight, and Gervonta Davis, we don't know what the future holds for him after this exhibition fight against Jake Paul in a few months. I think this is a fight that is well out of range due to the weight, and I don't think we'll ever see this fight between Gervonta Davis and Devin Haney. It's very unfortunate because I feel like with both of these talented fighters, what they bring to the table, the story that they have with each other, the history that they have with each other, the build-up for the fight would have been fun. With Bill Haney, Devin Haney's father, being involved, it would have been great, marketable. It would have been a marketable fight that would have drew a lot of casuals in to watch a big fight between Gervonta Davis and Devin Haney. But as their careers are going in different paths, with Devin now at 147, as he's climbed up two weight classes, I don't see Tank ever fighting at the welterweight division unless it would be for a really special fight. I just don't see that happening. And I don't know what Tank's plan is after this Jake Paul exhibition. I don't know if he's going to walk away from the sport. I don't know what's next, but I just think this is an unrealistic fight at this particular point, unfortunately, between Gervonta Davis and Devin Haney. A big what if these two ever shared the ring with each other. Second fight on my list would be Anthony Joshua versus Deontay Wilder. I don't know how the hell we never got Anthony Joshua versus Deontay Wilder in a boxing ring. That has to be one of the biggest what ifs in the modern era of the sport of boxing between Anthony Joshua and Deontay Wilder, because these are two great heavyweights of the modern era. And this fight should have happened a long time ago with Anthony Joshua and Deontay Wilder both in their prime of their careers. I don't understand how this fight didn't ever materialize. And if it ever does happen, I think the plot is already lost, and I think it has no meaning to the fight if Anthony Joshua and Deontay Wilder ever share a ring with each other. I just think the fight would be lackluster. I don't think it would be something that fans are truly invested in at this point, where how Deontay Wilder is basically in the twilight days of his boxing career, and Anthony Joshua might not be the same guy that he used to be. We'll see. Time will tell. But at one point, Deontay Wilder held the WBC heavyweight title for years. And Anthony Joshua he was a unified champion on two separate occasions at the heavyweight division before he lost the titles to Usyk, and Wilder lost the title to Fury. I just don't understand how we could have actually got an undisputed championship fight between these two respective parties. I know boxing politics might have played a factor in the reason why we didn't get Wilder versus Joshua. I think this is something that was completely left off the table. And I think this is something that we're going to look back at one day and think how special that fight would have been with both these respective fighters in the prime of their careers. Anthony Joshua, Deontay Wilder is definitely a big fight that will never get in the sport of boxing. And if it does happen, Maybe sometime 2026, it's lost its plot, it's lost its meaning because the fight is not going to be as special as what it could have been years and years ago in the sport. Next fight on my list would be Shakur Stevenson versus Vasily Lomachenko. Now, I love me some technical boxing. I love knockouts in boxing, yes, but I do love a classic chess match. And I think that's something we would have got between Shakur Stevenson and Vasily Lomachenko. Now, this fight was actually it was very realistic to make in the calendar year 2023, 2 years ago. If you guys remember, Devin Haney was the undisputed champion, but he already had plans of moving up to 140 at the super lightweight division. So the WBC title basically got put into recess, and the title became vacant. And at the time, Shakur Stevenson was the next guy in line because he was the mandatory to fight for the title. And there were several fighters that Shakur could have fought for the vacant title at the time. I'm talking about Frank Martin. I'm talking about Vasily Lomachenko, George Kambosos. There were several fighters that ducked Shakur Stevenson. And unfortunately, Lomachenko was one of those names back in 2023. Both are masterclass technicians in that boxing ring. I think this would have been a fun fight to get for the vacant WBC title. And I even if it didn't happen in 2023, it's still a fight that I wish happened before Lomachenko retired from the sport of boxing, because he was still at this lightweight division as an IBF champion before he walked away from the sport. So definitely a missed opportunity there. I would have loved to see how that fight would have materialized between Shakur Stevenson and Vasily Lomachenko. Next fight on my list, Errol Spence versus Manny Pacquiao. Now, if you guys remember 4 summers ago, back in the summer of 2021, we were actually less than 2 weeks away from getting Errol Spence versus Manny Pacquiao in a boxing ring. Unfortunately, this fight did not happen because Errol Spence suffered a torn retina in his eye, and he was not medically cleared to compete in a boxing ring. So therefore, Manny Pacquiao had to defend his WBA title against Ugas on a 12 days notice, and we did not get a title for unification fight at the welterweight division between Errol Spence and Manny Pacquiao. But it makes me think, with some 2 all-time greats at the welterweight division, and yes, I do believe that Errol Spence is a top 10 welterweight of all time because he was a unified champion holding it down at this division for a very long time until he got defeated by Crawford. Now, if Manny Pacquiao and Errol Spence would have had that fight, there could have been several different outcomes that played out. If Manny Pacquiao was successful and was the new unified champion of the welterweight division, that possibly could have set us up for a Crawford and Pacquiao fight. Or that could have changed the landscape with Errol Spence getting the titles even quicker, and Errol Spence picking up the biggest victory of his career, defeating a legend, an icon, and Hall of Famer Manny Pacquiao. So I think that would have been a special fight, but unfortunately with that retina, the torn retina in his eye, suffering that 2 weeks before the fight, it's a big welterweight fight that we never would have got. And I think that would have been a spectacular fight between Errol Spence and Manny Pacquiao. Next fight on my list is Errol Spence again, but Errol Spence versus Keith Thurman. Now, I think Errol Spence versus Keith Thurman would have been a really fun fight at the welterweight division. I'm not sure why Errol Spence never gave Keith Thurman a shot at 147. Now, Keith Thurman, if you go back to that, how from 2017 to 2023, how special this welterweight division, how loaded it was. I mean, you had Errol Spence, Manny Pacquiao, Terrence Crawford, Keith Thurman, Sean Porter, Ugas, Danny Garcia. I mean, this division was just stacked with some household names. And sometimes we didn't, well, not sometimes, but back then we didn't see all these guys mix it up. Now, Sean Porter is known for getting in the ring with all these guys. But as I digress, it's just weird that Errol Spence, as many names that he's defeated, like Mikey Garcia, Danny Garcia, Sean Porter, Ugas, it's very weird that he never gave Keith Thurman a shot at 147, and he's only lost 1 time in his boxing career to Manny Pacquiao. So then he claimed, at one point before we got the Crawford fight, Errol Spence claimed that he'd go up to 154 to fight Keith Thurman, but not defend his titles against him at 147. Now, this was right before the Crawford fight was actually finalized back in the spring of 2023, but I just find it weird that Errol Spence and Keith Thurman never shared a boxing ring with each other. Very weird and very strange. Next fight on my list, Terrence Crawford versus Jermell Charlo. Now, hear me out. I honestly think how things could have played out at 154, especially 2 summers ago, with Terrence Crawford, who's clearly still in the prime of his career, at 154 in 2023, early 2024, with a focused Jermell Charlo, this would have been an epic undisputed title fight in 154. Now, if you guys remember, Jermell Charlo was only stripped of having all 4 of the prestigious 154 titles because he moved up to fight Canelo, moved up 2 weight classes, and he honestly didn't even come to fight. He just came for a paycheck, basically laid down to Canelo, and was stripped of all of his titles. But if Jermell Charlo never did that and wanted to stay patient at 154, what he should have did was fight the winner of Errol Spence versus Terrence Crawford in the summer 2023. Meet them at his division at 154. But guys, that fight between Terrence Crawford and Jermell Charlo would have been really special at 154. I mean, these guys did not like each other. And if you remember, Terrence Crawford was beating the shit out of Errol Spence pillar to post and was taunting Jermell Charlo, who was sitting in the crowd saying, "You could be next." I mean, the press conferences would have been great for the fight. The build-up for the fight alone would have been spectacular. And I honestly think this would have been a really fun fight. I think Crawford would have defeated Jermell Charlo, but Jermell Charlo was a king, a master at 154. I think styles makes fights. I think that would have been a very entertaining fight between Terrence Crawford and Jermell Charlo if they ever fought each other at 154. Now, obviously, that fight's never going to happen because Crawford's never going back down to 154 at this point, and he doesn't have that much time left in boxing. And we don't know how Jermell Charlo is going to look 2.5 years when he returns back to the sport in probably early 2026 with a fight against Errol Spence. But guys, that would have been a really fun fight between Terrence Crawford and Jermell Charlo if we ever got that in the sport of boxing, especially at 154. Next fight on my list, Tyson Fury versus Anthony Joshua. I don't understand how one of the biggest fights in UK history never happened. I mean, Tyson Fury, popular, polarizing figure in the UK. Same with Anthony Joshua. How the hell have they never shared a ring with each other? Easily, with those 2 household names in the UK, they would honestly sell out Wembley Stadium in the UK. 2 of the greatest heavyweights of the modern era in the sport of boxing. They've done some great things in the sport, accomplished a lot of things. I think, honestly, 2026 is the last chance for this fight to ever be made between Tyson Fury and Anthony Joshua. I think someone would clearly get knocked out in that fight. But I think it's still a big fight that has a little chance to be made. But I think 2026 is the final straw for this fight ever to be made in the sport of boxing. Next fight on my list, Gervonta Davis versus Vasily Lomachenko. Now, this fight should have happened years ago between Gervonta Davis and Vasily Lomachenko. Whether it was Floyd Mayweather holding Gervonta Davis back in his early days where Vasily Lomachenko wanted a really early tank when Vasily Lomachenko was in the prime of his career, or it was Gervonta Davis trying to out-age Vasily Lomachenko, trying to fight Lomachenko when he was at the end of his career, or Lomachenko not accepting the fight when Gervonta Davis sent him an offer for them to fight in November for a lightweight title unification fight. Either way, it's very unfortunate that Gervonta Davis and Vasily Lomachenko never shared a boxing ring with each other. And it really would have been a fun fight. Even if Tank lost, it still would have been good for his resume. It still would have been good for the sport of boxing. And Tank even had a chance to defeat Vasily Lomachenko. You see what Tio did to Lomachenko. You see what Devin Haney did to Lomachenko. So Lomachenko wasn't this unstoppable guy in his prime. It was either Floyd holding Tank back or Tank never just wanted the fight. I think that would have been 50-50 regardless of any time those 2 respective fighters ever fought each other or were to fight each other. I think it would have been 50-50. And I wouldn't be surprised with whatever fighter got their hand raised if they ever fought each other before Lomachenko retired earlier this year in the sport of boxing. But I think that's a big fight that was left off the table. A lot of boxing fans would have loved that war between Gervonta Davis and Vasily Lomachenko. We're almost done here. Next fight on my list, Canelo Alvarez versus Dave Benavidez. Now, still would be a huge fight in the sport of boxing, but based off of the tournament events that happened last weekend, I think this fight has kind of lost its flavor. And it should have happened years ago at the super middleweight division at 168. And Dave Benavidez was the true mandatory for Canelo Alvarez's WBC title, which would have led to a undisputed undisputed championship fight. But Canelo Alvarez clearly didn't give David Benavidez a shot. And that's one of the reasons why David Benavidez is at 175, because he was sitting at 168 waiting and waiting and waiting for the big opportunity, the big fight against Canelo Alvarez, and he defeated everybody. He defeated Caleb Plant, Demetrius Andre, I mean, there was nothing else for David Benavidez to do at 168, so he had to move up to 175 to get bigger opportunities. And he's still looking for bigger opportunities at 175. But now with David being the light heavyweight champion, being the WBC light heavyweight champion, Canelo would have to challenge him and go up to 175 for this fight to be made. I don't see David going down to 168 to fight Canelo, especially with no titles on the line at that point. But Canelo does have 2 fights left on his deal with Turki Al-Sheikh in 2026, so it's never say never in the sport of boxing. Canelo gets paid enough. I don't see why he wouldn't get in the ring with David Benavidez, and it could be a passing of the torch moment if David Benavidez could defeat Canelo Alvarez. But I'm starting to lose hope in this fight, but never say never in the sport of boxing. I think that would have been one of the biggest fights to be made if Canelo just pulled the trigger and just gave David Benavidez a shot years ago in the sport of boxing. And last but not least on my list would be Manny Pacquiao versus Terence Crawford. Now, from 2017 to 2020 at the welterweight division, all the names that I just said a few moments ago, this felt like this had a real chance, a real opportunity of happening with Manny Pacquiao and Terence Crawford. This fight should have happened at welterweight. Now, I think the reason why this fight didn't happen, politics played a factor. If you guys remember, it was so hard for promoters to work with each other until fucking Turki Al-Sheikh stepped in. But at the time, Manny Pacquiao was with PBC and Al Heyman. At the time, Terence Crawford was with Top Rank and Bob Arum. So I think it was Bob Arum holding Crawford back from getting the big opportunities, the big fights at welterweight. So it was difficult for Crawford to work with anybody that was a fighter with the PBC, because most of those welterweights at the time were signed with Al Heyman and the PBC. That's why they were getting the big time fights, and Crawford had to wait on the sidelines for a while until he got that big opportunity against Earl Spence. But I think this would have been a really fun fight between Manny Pacquiao and Terence Crawford if those 2 legends, 2 Hall of Famers would have shared the ring with each other. Crawford being a future Hall of Famer. But those are my boxing fights that I think should have happened. And I think these are the biggest fights to never happen in the modern era in the sport of boxing.